Radika. My name is Will Friedman, President and CEO of the Cleveland-Cuyahoga County Port Authority. That's a mouthful, so we usually just refer to ourselves as the Port of Cleveland. Sometimes just the Port Authority works as well. And I'm going to give you an overview of the port very quickly, so you know who we are, what our role is. I'm going to talk about international shipping, which I think is our main topic of interest, and give you a little bit of history, a little bit of our current state of affairs, a little bit of our aspirations as a port. I'm going to talk about some of the other roles of the port. We're a fairly unique port authority in that we provide access to capital and a couple of other programs that I want you to be aware of that I think are relevant to you in your businesses and your connections to international trade, international business. So let me start with our port. You can't see our port terminals from our window here, but you can certainly see Lake Erie. Just to orient you geographically, we're connected in the Great Lakes to the rest of the world via the St. Lawrence Seaway. And so you'll see ocean-going ships passing in front of our window here and calling our port on a regular basis. There's also quite a bit of shipping within the Great Lakes, and that's an important part of our history here in Cleveland as an industrial region as well, with raw materials moving for the most part on the Great Lakes. But we're going to talk mostly about the international shipping side of the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Seaway, and I'm going to speak mostly about that. Our Port Authority was created almost 50 years ago. We'll be 50 years old next year. We were created in 1968. Many communities in the Great Lakes, once the St. Lawrence Seaway opened up in 1959, created port authorities to build the infrastructure for international shipping, and Cleveland was one of those communities. When the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway was opened, there was a lot of fanfare, there was a lot of optimism that the Great Lakes would become the fourth coast. It was sometimes referred to as the fourth coast, and didn't quite turn out that way, which I'll come back to in a minute. After our Port Authority was created in 1968, we started improving the docks here in Cleveland, trying to attract international trade, working with companies locally. Trade increased for about 10 years or so, and then it started to dip in the Great Lakes. And we've been competing hard and fighting hard for cargo since then. In addition to our role as a shipping port, we're very active in financing all sorts of real estate developments and uses in our region, which is a somewhat atypical role for a port authority to play. Developed here in Ohio, in Toledo with their port, and also in Cleveland with our port. And we now have a very robust statutory authority to provide primarily project revenue bond financing for many projects. Could be relevant for foreign direct investment projects, certainly relevant for manufacturing, for distribution and logistics facilities. And we have done, I think our total is now close to $3.5 billion, maybe inching up toward $4 billion in project revenue bond issuances since the first, which was the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Museum in the mid-1990s. So many of the larger projects you'll see getting built across our region have some port financing, port bond financing, as well as usually other sources of financing as well. We're very good here, as you're going to hear, I think, from Steve Stranish as well, with Cleveland International Funding, putting together lots of sources of financing for projects, to make projects happen here in our region. So I would encourage you in whatever you do to consider the Port Authority as a potential source of capital for you for your real estate development projects. We're also involved with new market tax credit deployment with Radika Reddy, with her and some other partners. 10, 15 years ago, we created an entity called the Northeast Ohio Development Fund, which has successfully deployed new market tax credits now for a number of very, very significant projects across our region as well. So keep us in mind as far as new market tax credit deployment. We won't go into all the weeds on that topic right now. And I'll touch on a bit. I'll come back to foreign trade zones. I want to mention foreign trade zones as another tool that might be relevant for you in your business if you're involved in international trade. I'll briefly mention our role with infrastructure in the community, especially dredging, and just sort of over my shoulder here is where we put dredge material. If you look out this window, you'll see some earth-moving equipment that's moving around dredge material as it comes in from dredging the Cuyahoga River right now, as a matter of fact. So I'll just mention that briefly as well. So let me come back to shipping, international trade. When containerization first came about in really the 1960s and into the 1970s and enabled global trade as we know it, putting cargo of all types into those ubiquitous steel boxes and then being able to load those on ships and trains and trucks intermodally, it really changed the world, really enabled global trade. And unfortunately, we don't see that kind of shipping here in the Great Lakes. We were sort of left out of the container revolution, which was not good for us here in this region. And what we've been trying to do for the past 6-7 years or so here at our port is bring container shipping back to the Great Lakes. There's no reason it can't happen here. There are a number of factors that caused it to go away. One of them is that they closed down the St. Lawrence Seaway in the winter, and that's tough because shippers, the customers, and the carriers don't like that. They want to be able to operate year-round on this system. We're trying to get that changed. We hope someday we can change that and become a year-round system or close to a year-round system. That would help us tremendously. There are also other costs and other inefficiencies that are really policies due to governmental policies, due to regulation, that we'd also like to see reformed, and we'd like to get a level playing field in the Great Lakes. If we had that, I remain convinced that we would see much more container shipping in and out of the heartland of America. This is the only deep water, navigable waterway anywhere in the world that I'm aware of that is underutilized, is this system, the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway system. Those of you who are from here, you probably don't realize that. If you're from other parts of the world, especially in Asia, where there's been tremendous port development, trade has grown very rapid rates for years and years now. You're probably much more accustomed to seeing big ports, big container ports, port development, and really that's a centerpiece of economic development strategy in many Asian countries and all over the world. Here, we don't really think of our port that way, we don't think of our waterways that way, and I think that's a shame. So we've been trying to change that. We've been trying to make our port much more relevant. We started a service to Europe that we call the Cleveland Europe Express. It's for containerized cargo as well as non-containerized cargo, and it's a scheduled service, which on the Great Lakes is very uncommon. In fact, it's the only scheduled service for containers on the Great Lakes. Every 2 weeks, a ship to Antwerp, primarily in Europe, with a few intermediate stops. That gives us something that no other Great Lakes city or Great Lakes port has, that connection. And we're working very hard to market that connection to companies that are exporting from Ohio, companies that are importing into Ohio. And we want to become much more of a commonly used either port of entry or export point for shippers in our region. Not going to happen overnight. We're in our 4th season, we'll go into our 5th season next year, but we're going to keep at it. And we think it's important because it makes us more competitive. It makes our region more competitive. We can reduce transportation costs, enhance transportation efficiencies for moving cargo to Europe and points beyond. We believe that makes our firms here more likely to expand, invest, hire more employees, and compete successfully in the global marketplace. So I think that's our top priority of the port, and we've invested quite heavily in that service over the last 3 or 4 years. And again, I would encourage you, if you're not aware of it, or if you know or work for a company that might be able to take advantage of it, contact me, contact others at the port. We're easy to access, and we'd be happy to talk to you some more about Cleveland New York Express. We also have other ships, other carriers who are frequently in and out of our port, serving all parts of the world. Just today we have a ship in port that is delivering a couple of presses. One of them is going to the GM Lordstown plant. These are enormous heavy pieces. You want to move those by water as far as you can because they're so difficult to move over the road. We see that kind of cargo frequently. There are a lot of companies in Ohio that manufacture large, heavy pieces of equipment, capital goods, and machinery, and there's a lot of that kind of cargo that moves into our region for manufacturing here. Believe it or not, we've seen a lot of beer tanks recently that are made in Germany, big fermenting tanks. The whole, craft beer business is booming so much that we see a lot of those being shipped into the U.S. as another example of project cargoes. So we are eager to handle more of that freight, and we have excellent infrastructure here in Cleveland in terms of crane capacity, area available on our port, management, the terminal operating company at our port, as well as the labor at our port, who are very, very experienced in handling these cargoes. So, all in all, the maritime sector of our region is still very important. If you include the international freight, domestic freight, iron ore that moves up the river through the port's bulk terminal to the steel mill and other industries, you look at the direct jobs and the indirect jobs, the multiplier from all that, it's about 20,000 jobs and $3.5 billion in economic activity in total, still dependent on moving cargo by water. The other things I mentioned and I want to touch on quickly, foreign trade zone. Those of you who, some of you may be familiar with foreign trade zone. I see John Sinisi here. Neotech, our partner in administering our zone here in this region and the zone just south of us. I always forget the numbers, John. The
181 and 40.
181 and 40. So the foreign trade zone program has been around for a long time. I won't go into it in much detail, but essentially if you're importing and sometimes exporting, re-exporting, it allows you to save money. You can bring goods into a zone. You can defer paying import duty. You can undertake many value-added activities to that cargo while it remains in the zone before you enter it into U.S. commerce and have to pay duty. Many of the large auto plants, such as Honda, which was mentioned earlier by the Consul General, take advantage of foreign trade zones. You bring the parts in to the plant as a zone. You build the car, they assemble the car, and then they pay the duty on the car instead of paying the duty on all the parts. It's one example of how I can save money. And it's again, I would encourage you, if you're importing, and even if you're importing and then maybe re-exporting to Canada or Mexico, to look at zone status as a way to save money. I mentioned our bond financing, and I went into bond financing a little bit, and I don't want to go too much further into it. But again, just encourage you to, if you're talking to your bank, if you're talking to your accountant, if you're trying to figure out how to finance a capital investment, a real estate expansion, come and talk to us at the port, and we may be able to help you. Let's see. I mentioned zones. I mentioned new market tax credits. Anything I forgot out of that list?
The shipping line that goes from Europe to
India.
India.
I mentioned that. Cleveland New York Express. Yes. talk about it. Got it. Oh, dredging. I was going to spend just a second on my favorite topic, dredging. So we have a 5-mile ship channel that goes up the Cuyahoga River and it ends essentially at the steel mill, which is now an ArcelorMittal mill. Very important mill for us here in this region. Major supplier of steel to many, many industries throughout Ohio. And it happens to be a center of excellence for ArcelorMittal worldwide in terms of very high strength, lightweight steel, which is very important, particularly in the automotive industry going forward. The iron ore that feeds that steel mill, the raw material, comes down from Minnesota, the iron ore range, and a lot of it is all of it eventually is moved up river, and that river has to be dredged. The Cuyahoga River has to be dredged every year. We do that in a partnership with the federal government. You've probably heard over the years that we've had a fight with the federal government, state of Ohio, and the port. For our side of it has said we don't want that material dumped in the open waters of Lake Erie because it still has trace amounts of PCBs and other contaminants in it, which can get in the food chain. Finally, I think we've convinced the federal government after going to court that that's a bad idea, and they need to back off of that idea and stop trying to use that as a way to push some of the cost onto us. Instead, we put the material out here right in front of us in what we call a confined disposal facility. But the innovation that we're bringing to it recently is we're using more and more of the material. And I know that sounds a little bit inconsistent with, well, if it can't go into the lake, how can we use it if it still has contaminants in it? But the lake is actually the worst place to put it because then it becomes available to worms, and fish eat the worms and we eat the fish. But if you encapsulate it in the ground, that doesn't happen. And so we've been working with Ohio EPA and State of Ohio to find more and more ways to use the material beneficially and therefore create more capacity at these CDFs, which are basically big landfills. We don't have to fill them up as fast. And that project's going quite well. We're pleased to report that we have, I think, won this long dispute with the Army Corps and safeguarded our drinking water and some of the food we might eat in terms of fish for years to come. So anyway, I guess I'll wrap it up with that. I think I'm getting the hook from Radhika, and we can either do questions afterwards or before today.
One question. Anybody?
Yes, ma'am.
I have a question about, we talk about financing projects, and I'm curious to know when did you get into this atypical business from a shipping company, and where do you get the funding compared to banks? Like, do you subject the regulation like the banks, and what are the challenges or risks that you see a shipping company?
Okay, that was a compound question. Your first question was, why did we get into it? Okay, quickly on that, it started with the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, really, where after the city had competed and won the Rock Hall, it was a nationwide competition to see who would win. Cleveland won, and then people said, how do we finance this? We got to build this facility now. And so I wasn't here at the time, but what I hear is that there were a group of civic leaders who became aware that, we could get our port to float bonds, to issue bonds, as long as we can figure out how to pay them back. As long as we can pledge a revenue stream to pay them back, we can use the port as the vehicle to issue the bonds. That was the beginning point, and then we kept doing it going forward. There was somebody who had my job previously who was very good at bond financing. He was a lawyer by training, and he had heard some things from other people. Believe it or not, it all started, I think, in St. Paul, Minnesota. There was a port authority there that had sort of turned itself into a development authority. So we copied that to a certain extent. And then you'd asked about...
actually, the major source of your financing, can I understand it's still using...
Okay, these are project revenue bonds, which means that the proponent of the project, the borrower, it's really a borrowing, is the source of repayment of the bond. So somebody would come to us and say, I want to build a multi-story condominium building, and so the bond buyer, the bond purchaser, essentially the lender, would look at the credit and the credit worthiness of that borrower. And the port is a conduit. It's just passing through us, but it requires a public issuer of those bonds the way U.S. Laws are written. So it's really it's almost like a private borrowing transaction that just happens to be flowing through a public issuer. That's the way to look at it.
Thank you. Thank you.